Akce D.O.S.T na dnešní akci. Na hovorech s Nigelem Faragem. Ještě dříve, než předám slovo předsedovi Akce D.O.S.T panu Michalu Semínovi, bych chtěl oslovit pana Schweinera z techniky, jestli by mohl všem přítomným znovu připomenout, pokud je o tom neinformoval, jakým způsobem se ovládají ta sluchátka pro tlumočení, abyste všichni, kteří je potřebujete, měli sluchátka k dispozici.
Dámy a pánové, jste se to vyzkoušeli, kanál číslo 5, hlasitost ovládá tím druhým sofičkem. Až budeme končit, prosili bychom, abyste nám zde velmi zodpovědně sluchátka s tím přístrojem odevzdávali, protože jeden ten přístroj stojí 10 000 korun a samozřejmě nikomu by vám k ničemu nebyl, Toť vše.
Děkuju, já to ještě zopakuju, pokud nikdo neslyšel. Kanál číslo 5 si nalaďte a tím druhým tlačítkem se ovládá hlasitost. Sluchátka potom odevzdejte panu Schweinerovi při odchodu. Děkuju.
Dámy a pánové, milí přátelé, je mi ctí přivítat vás na přednášce pana poslance Nigela Farage, poslance Evropského parlamentu za britskou stranu UKIP. Pan Nigel Farage je právem považován za nejvýraznějšího kritika procesu evropské integrace, varujícího před postupnou a v mnoha směrech nezvratnou demontáží svrchovaných evropských států, občanských svobod a zastupitelské demokracie. Když ve svých prvních projevech na půdě Evropského parlamentu, tedy od roku 1999, varoval před tragickými důsledky direktivně prosazované unifikace Evropy a centralizace moci na nadnárodní úrovni, stal se pro naprostou většinu stoupenců evropské integrace terčem posměchu. Dnes už se panu Farageovi směje jen málo. I ti nejfanatičtější ideologové Eurobabylonu si nyní uvědomují, že pan Farage nehovořil do větru, když upozorňoval na škodlivé sociální, hospodářské i morální dopady budování lidmi nevyžádaného evropského státu. Proti jeho předvídavosti, vycházející z reality, z poznání skutečného stavu věcí, kladly a bohužel stále kladou jen ideologicky zatížené fráze a sofismy. Jinak ani nemohou. Teď fakta hovoří proti nim. Návštěva Nigela Farage je pro Akci D.O.S.T a jistě nejen pro ní velkou vzpruhou a povzbuzením. V našem boji proti novým z procesu evropské integrace odvozeným internacionálním snahám o ovládnutí evropských národů. Ještě než panu poslanci Farageovi předám slovo, rád bych mezi námi přivítal alespoň několik vážených hostů. Všichni jste naši vážení hosté, ale odpusťte mi, alespoň pár jmen bych tu přeci jen zmínil. Vítám mezi námi tajemníka prezidenta republiky pana Ladislava Jakla, pana vicekancléře prezidenta republiky pana Petra Hájka, spolupracovníka pana prezidenta v otázkách zahraniční politiky pana Jiřího Brodského. V souvislosti mi dovolte takovou malou odbočku ve vší vážnosti. Bych vás chtěl informovat o tom, že pokud se zmíněný pan Ladislav Jakl, signatář manifestu D.O.S.T a náš blízký spolupracovník, rozhodne účastnit se klání o prezidentský stolec v příštím roce, tak jak on už jistě delší dobu ví, bude to s naší plnou podporou, s podporou Akce D.O.S.T. Dále zde vítám kolegu pana poslance Farage z Evropského parlamentu, pana poslance Ivo Strejčka, pana senátora Pakostu, naší dlouhodobou spolupracovnící a další osobou, která má naší podporu ve svém politickém klání, je paní Jana Bobošíková, předsedkyně Suverenity. Rád bych také ze srdce poděkoval všem, kteří nám při přípravě a realizaci návštěvy pana poslance Faráže pomohli, ať už finančně nebo jinými prostředky. Rovněž chci poděkovat všem, kteří pro české publikum, pro to naše prostředí, myšlenky Nigela Farage zprostředkovávají. Zvláště chci zmínit občanské sdružení Reformy, portály Euroseptic a EU portál. A nyní mi již dovolte, abych panu poslanci Farážovi předal slovo.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Come on, let's get this thing livened up a little bit. We are engaged in nothing less than a huge political battle to save democracy, to save the concept of nation states, and to take us away from this new form of government that is emerging in Brussels, Frankfurt and Luxembourg, that frankly, I think, and I'm sure many of you in a country that live behind the Iron Curtain must think, looks more and more with each passing day like a recreation of the old, undemocratic and failing Soviet Union. And the battle that we fight is a battle to make sure that our children and grandchildren can grow up and live in a free democracy as free people. It's just as important as that. It's funny really that I'm here in Prague, and thank you very much everybody for inviting me. But it's all rather odd really, because I'm not really a politician at all. Now my advice to those of you who ever want to do any public speaking is never begin with an apology, but no, I must apologise. Because if anybody came along here today expecting to see a career professional politician, they're in for a very profound disappointment. No, I was educated at one of England's most expensive public schools and left having failed virtually everything at the age of 18, did not proceed to university and went straight to work in the City of London. And I was involved in the commodities business on an institution called the London Metal Exchange, where we bought and sold copper, aluminium, lead, zinc, nickel, tin, and were the hub in fact of a truly global market. So I actually now consider I have a big advantage over most career politicians, because generally, if you look at Western countries, we're now run by a bunch of college kids who've never actually had a job in the real world. They haven't served in the army, they haven't run a business, they haven't risen through the ranks of a trade union or through a charity. Most of them go straight from university into becoming research officers, and then they become members of parliament, ministers, sometimes even prime ministers, and if it all goes completely wrong, they finish up, of course, as European commissioners. But perhaps a bit more of that later. So no, I feel I have a slight advantage, because I always say to people that I worked in that City of London, and for 20 years I worked damned hard up until lunchtime every single day. And for those that know the booze culture of Britain in the 80s, you've probably seen the Brits on stag weekends here, so you might understand what I mean. I was never going to be involved in politics, but I was a supporter of Margaret Thatcher, who I thought was an incredibly brave woman. You know, she recognised something, that when she came to power, top-rate tax in Britain on earned income was 83%. Top-rate tax in Britain on unearned income was an incredible 98%. And of course what was happening in Britain, in the 70s, was our very brightest and best would leave our top universities, and before becoming doctors, before becoming surgeons, before becoming lawyers or accountants, the first thing they did was to catch an aeroplane somewhere else. And we finished up losing the cream of a generation, and they went to Australia, they went to America, they went across the world. And what Thatcher did, by making taxes reasonable, is she gave people an incentive to work hard, an incentive to stay in the country, an incentive to reinvest in the country. And she got rid of a whole mass of statist, protectionist legislation. And by the end of her 11 years, and certainly where I worked, in the City of London, suddenly we saw money flowing into Britain from across the world as global companies wanted to invest in our country. So economically, if you worked in a coal field, if you worked in a state-subsidised car company, it might have been a tough few years. But overall, for Great Britain PLC, we saw the most unprecedented rise in personal income and personal wealth. So I was busy working in the city, earning lots of money, of course being young, spending even more, but never mind. And you know, I would play golf at weekends, and go to the pub in my village on a Sunday lunchtime, and was bringing up a young family. And you know, there was nothing, but I never even stood for local council. But when I heard the news in October 1990, that the Conservative government had taken Britain into the exchange rate mechanism, the method by which we pegged sterling effectively against the Deutschmark, I won't share with this audience what my initial words were, but suffice to say they were not particularly complimentary. Because one of the things that I'd seen in my career in the city was that whatever governments think, they can fix the price. They can fix the price of a commodity. They can fix the price of a currency. What economic history had taught me was that governments in those situations have a 100% track record of always being wrong. Because you have imbalances in markets. You know, and you have markets that go up and markets that go down, and set government pricing doesn't work. So this was my initial wake-up call. And the next day, I caught the train up to London, and I read my newspaper, and I realised that not only had the Conservatives signed us up to this big step towards us joining the euro, but that they'd done so with the full-hearted consent of the so-called opposition parties in Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And it was the first time in my life that I recognised the emergence of this new political class. A class who on all the big issues fundamentally agree. I often say in Britain that you can't put a cigarette paper between Miliband and Cameron on most major issues of substance. So I started to get angry. And then I saw a treaty that was signed at Maastricht. And I took the time and trouble to read it, which I discovered later was more than most of our members of Parliament had done. They just did what the party whip told them to do. And I read this treaty, and it seemed to me that if this treaty was passed, effectively, nearly all of our laws would be made somewhere else. That we wouldn't actually be governing our own country, and that we would hand over power, not just overseas, but to an institution, namely the European Commission, who I was to clash with later, but we'd be handing over power to a European Commission who we cannot elect and we cannot dismiss, and which therefore goes completely against any principle of democratic accountability. So I was so angry after Maastricht that I decided I must do something about it. And I found this very small group of about a dozen intellectuals that I met in London, and we set up this new party. And within a few weeks of this party being formed, there was a by-election for a British parliamentary constituency. So I stood, and I was UKIP's first ever candidate. I'd never fought an election. Nobody in the party had ever fought an election. We hadn't got a clue what we were doing. And when the night of the results came out, I discovered that by a stunning, massive 48 votes, I had managed to beat the leader of Britain's official monster raving loony party, and therefore I'd not quite come last. So to say that politically UKIP started from very small beginnings, I think would be entirely accurate. Anyway, I battled my way through. I fought a whole series of elections. I never wavered from my view that Europe, or the European Union rather, was headed in the right direction. And then in 1999, I found myself elected to the European Parliament, which some people think odd, as I don't really think British MEPs should be in the European Parliament. But I've tried to use that platform of going to Brussels, of seeing what goes on. I've tried to use that platform back in the United Kingdom to wake people up and to educate people as to what has been done in their name. And my first term there was a relatively low-key affair. But in 2004, I found myself group leader, joint leader of a group in the European Parliament, and indeed Vladimir Zelensky, who's in the room, in fact used to sit, I think, the next row behind me in that Parliament. And I found myself for the first time actually on the big stage, politically. And this was the day when a new commission was being presented to the European Parliament. And it was amazing. Everybody said that it was absolutely wonderful that we had this new European Commission. They were all absolutely top-class people, and the Parliament should have no hesitation in approving of this deal. And we went round the room, and the group leader of the EPP, and the group leader of the Socialists, and the group leader of the Greens, one Daniel Cohn-Bendit, of course well known for the 1968 Paris riots, but how clever some of these people are at reinventing themselves. And they went round the room with everybody saying what a marvellous thing it was that we had this new European Commission, and that it meant that Europe was on the road to reform. Anyway, they got round to me, and this was my first big go, and I said, I thought the Parliament ought to know that before we approve this Commissioner, that there are one or two little difficulties. Was the Parliament aware that the French Commissioner had just 4 years ago been convicted of embezzlement, given a 2-year suspended prison sentence, and barred from public office for life? Which I thought was quite a good start to a speech, really, in those circumstances. And it was as if, you know, a bomb had gone off. Suddenly people were screaming and shouting, and there was this funny little Frenchman who sits about, I don't know, 10 metres to the left of me, and he sort of jumped up and started waving his arms to the President, saying that, you know, the hearing should be stopped. And I went on through this full list of people who, of course, in communist times, people like Kadar, you know, that worked hand in glove with the Soviet regime. I talked about the British Commissioner, Peter Mandelson, who twice had been sacked from the British Cabinet, once for a mortgage fraud, for which the rest of us would have gone to prison, but as I pointed out, he was actually one of the better ones. And I went through this speech, and the funny thing was, this little Frenchman to the left of me, who was, by this time, he was getting really agitated. He'd gone absolutely crimson, and he was running up and down the corridors like a man stuck in a burning building looking for the exit. I mean, I thought the chap would keel over at any moment. You know, he really was in a bad way. Anyway, I sat down, and this was the first time they decided to turn their guns on me, something I was to get used to as the years developed. And I was told that I was a disgrace, that I brought shame on the European Parliament, that I had to apologise, and that everything I said was lies, and that if I didn't withdraw, then I would have to face the full legal consequences for what I'd done. Which is funny, really, because I thought the whole point about Parliament's folks was that you were able to stand up and within reason Say what you thought. Well, the story was that indeed I was right, that the Frenchman had been convicted of embezzlement. But in France, they got rid of a monarchy, but they replaced it with a president who has far more powers than Louis XIV ever had. And what Chirac had done is he'd given this guy a very special kind of French amnesty. And what it means in France is not only is the individual forgiven, but it didn't ever happen. Oh yes, but it gets better. And not only did it not happen, but it then becomes a criminal offence to say that it did happen. And that I'd uttered these words on French soil. So the question was, would there be some awful police van waiting for me outside the door, or would I be the modern day Papillon and sent off to some terrible prison island for what I'd done? In fact, in the end, it was adjudged that even though we were in France, that the European Parliament soil itself was extraterritorial. And of course the funny little Frenchman who got so agitated and was running up and down the corridors, well, it turned out, I didn't know who he was, but it turned out he was a former French culture minister who'd been convicted in the same scandal. So that taught me quite a lot about the Parliament. And we fought on. And of course in those days, we had something called the European Constitution, with Giscard at the helm, and quite unashamedly, they decided that they would turn the Union into a full legal state. And we in our group did what we could to fight that. Now, very few countries had the opportunity of having a referendum on this. Very, very few indeed. But the French, of course, did have a referendum on the Constitution, and the French said no. And I remember just 4 nights later, the Dutch had a referendum on the Constitution too. And we were all in session at the European Parliament, and about 100 of us were in the press bar at 9 o'clock, waiting for the results to come out from the Netherlands, and up the results came, and 2/3 of the Dutch had said no to the Constitution. And I thought, that's it. We've beaten them. The French have killed this thing, the Dutch have buried it, we've struck a real blow here for democracy, we've changed the future of the European Union. I really did think, at that moment, we'd achieved something very significant indeed. More fool me. For at that moment, as we stood there, with champagne opening and people generally celebrating, at that moment, I saw a German MEP called Joe Leinen, socialist German MEP, and somebody who'd been a co-author of the constitutional document itself, working directly for Giscard. And I saw Leinen walking down the corridor, obviously off to do an interview. And so what I did is I made my way across to him as modestly as I possibly could in the circumstances, which I suspect wasn't all that great really. And I asked him whether he'd like to join us in a glass of champagne to celebrate the fact that the will of the people had been heard. And he looked at me. He said, "Nigel, you have your little celebration tonight. We have 50 different ways to win." And one of those funny moments in life, when you go from elation to just everything draining out of me. And it was the first time I realised that what we were up against here were bad people. And by that I mean, not people with whom I have a differing opinion. You can disagree with people on all sorts of things in life and actually have a civilised, friendly conversation with them. You can respect the fact that another person has a different view to you. Well, within a couple of weeks of Leinen saying that to me, the Constitution was dropped and it was rebranded, if you remember, as the Lisbon Treaty. And we had a guy called D'Amato, a former Italian Prime Minister, who publicly said that the good thing about calling it a treaty and not a constitution is we won't need to put it to referendums. That is what these people did to get these laws through. And that is the moment at which I think the European Union changed. And if I'd been Eurosceptic up until that point in 2005, well, since 2005, I have been an outright opponent of the whole thing. I think it is bad, I think it is evil, I think it is wrong, I think it is not undemocratic. Don't let people con you that there's a democratic deficit in the European Union. And all we need to do is to tweak it at the edges, and somehow it'll all be better. The European Union is not undemocratic. The European Union is anti-democratic. It does not... So we have a fight on our hands to get back this very precious thing. Our right of national self-determination, our ability through the ballot box. And I became even more determined in 2005 to really dedicate my life to fighting this thing. Firstly in the United Kingdom, but if I could be of assistance anywhere else in the European Union, to do so there as well. And indeed we did get our opportunity, because even though they called it a treaty, one country had to have a referendum on Lisbon, and it was of course Ireland. And we got together and we found that in the European Parliament's information budget, which is designed to be used by MEPs to tell the populace what a wonderful thing the European institutions were, there were no rules that prohibited us from using money to tell people that perhaps it wasn't a very good thing. And so we clubbed together some money and we managed to put a booklet through the door of every single house in Ireland. And when the Irish voted no to the Lisbon Treaty, the Irish Prime Minister got up in Bedoyle, the Irish Parliament in Dublin, deeply embarrassed, and said, "Nigel Farage and a group of subversives in Strasbourg have hijacked our democracy." And I thought, yes, please. You know, they'd spent millions of taxpayers' money on the other side. We'd spent but a mere fraction, but we've been able to get a no vote to Lisbon. But of course, none of it mattered, because they were bullied and forced to vote again, and the yes side, you know, once again, flooded the place with money and filled people with fear. But I've gone on battling, and I've gone on fighting, and of course one of the provisions of that Lisbon Treaty was that Europe, or the European Council, would now have a full-time president. And this was deemed to be a very important thing. In fact, so important was it that we were told that when we got a president of Europe, it would be a figure of such stature. It would be a figure of such stature. Stop making me laugh. Figure of such stature that he would stop the traffic in Washington and Beijing. So we all thought, crikey, this must really be important. And of course what we got was Herman Van Rompuy. And I have to say, I don't think in the history of parliamentary tradition that what I said or did was particularly out of order. You know, I'm okay. I wasn't particularly nice about him, but if you think about it, I said we were told we would get a giant, towering figure, but what we got, Mr. Van Rompuy, was you. You have the charisma of a damp rag, the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk, and the question that I want to ask, the question we all want to ask is, who are you? I've never heard of you. Nobody in Europe's ever. No, it wasn't that bad, folks, was it, really? Anyway, it seemed to cause terrible trouble. And the next morning, Jerzy Buzek, the Polish president of the parliament, I was summoned to meet Jerzy Buzek at 9 o'clock in his office. Now, piece of advice, folks, if you're called into an office for a meeting and coffee is not offered, you know you're in some trouble. So, Mr. Buzek looked at me in this sort of terribly grave manner. I mean, you'd have thought we were on the verge of nuclear war or something, you know. And Mr. Buzek looked at me and he said, "What you have done, Mr. Farage, is totally unacceptable. You have brought shame on the European institutions." To which I said, "Well, you've been making a fairly good job of it yourselves, haven't you?" And he said, "I'm asking you to apologise." He said, "I'm asking you to apologise. I want you to apologise to Mr. Herman Van Rompuy. I want you to apologise to the European Parliament. I want you to apologise to the people of Belgium." I said, "Well, I mean, is there any advance on this? Is there anybody else in the world while I'm at it that you want me to apologise to?" And he said, "Well, Mr. Farage, you know, if you don't apologise, we will levy upon you the biggest fine that the Parliament is able to levy." And he said, "You have to understand that your remarks to Mr. Van Rompuy were totally unacceptable because he's unelected." I said, "President Buzek, that's the very point I was making." Anyway, it clearly was going nowhere. So I walked out of the office into this bank of cameras, flashing, flashing, flashing. And obviously, you know, the President's office had briefed the press that I would be forced to apologise, or, as they saw it, I would be humiliated by being fined. They don't really get my politics, do they? And so I went out, and this bank of cameras, and they're all screaming at me, "Are you going to apologise? Are you going to apologise?" And I said, "Quiet, please." I said, "Look, you know, I have to be the first to recognise that sometimes in life we go over the top. Sometimes in life we get things wrong. Sometimes in life it is better to be a man and to apologise for what you have done. And so I've decided that I will unconditionally apologise to bank clerks all over the world for the offence I might have caused them." So they fined me 10 days' pay, and I have to say it was the cheapest PR publicity I've ever had. And no regrets at all. Quite what they're going to do to me next time, I don't know. But you know what, folks? I don't care. Because I might have a laugh and a joke whilst I do this, but I'm absolutely deadly serious about what I do. We are being run by bad people. Economically, they are taking those countries that are trapped inside the Eurozone ever closer to the edge of the precipice. What is happening in the Mediterranean is not just an economic or political story, it is a story of real human suffering. Real human suffering. And we have people now in those countries who are without hope. So without hope are they, we've even seen the emergence of a genuine neo-Nazi party in Greece. And I fear that yesterday's election result and the continuing worsening economic situation in Greece could lead that country towards bloody revolution. And isn't it ironic that the project that was set up to stop there ever being war in Europe again, the project that was set up to stop extreme nationalism, the project that was set up to make us feel more European and to like each other more, is now actually creating the very opposite effect. You cannot take away from people their nationality, their identity, their sense of belonging. You cannot give people a new flag, a new anthem, a new police force, a new army, a new state, a new identity. You cannot give people these things unless you have sought their consent. And nobody in Europe has ever really been told the truth by the so-called mainstream politicians. They've been handed this literally as a fait accompli. And it isn't going to work. And far from giving us a Europe of peace and harmony, we now see the Greek press and the German press, you know, slagging each other off every day. Goodness knows what the football match is going to be like on Thursday. It isn't going to work. And centralised economic management based on 5-year and 10-year plans. Does that sort of strike an echo in this room with one or two people?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but come on, you've lived under this before. It doesn't work. And I want to see, in countries like this country and the other countries that lived under communist rule, I think the people of these countries deserve rather better, frankly, than they've currently got. I saw in 2004 a crop of politicians come from these countries to sit with us in the European Parliament, and I believed when I first met them that they were actually going to do a good job. In the main, they have simply surrendered. Taken in by the money, taken in by the perks and the lifestyle, and taken in by that, I suppose, very normal human feeling of actually wanting to be liked by the people that are around you. I have to say it's never bothered me very much, but it is a normal thing to want to be liked. So we do need a rebirth of fresh, new, democratic movements from these countries. You know, as it stands, we're seeing across the north of Europe the growth of some really good, fresh politics. And it's now the time for Central Europe, for Eastern Europe, and for Southern Europe to give birth to those movements. Right across Europe, public opinion is changing. It is crying out for people who will present honest politics. Not the politics of the extremes, the politics of nation state, the politics of democracy, the politics of normality, the politics of wanting to trade and to get on with your neighbours, of wanting to be friends with them, of wanting a positive vision for what Europe can be. But folks, if any of you think that we can actually reform or change or make this current European Union better, then please think about my experiences. Please think about those victories that we secured against the Constitution, about the victory we secured against the Lisbon Treaty. None of it is worth anything. We are up against bad people who are prepared to bulldoze these results aside. We are up against total and absolute fanatics. If communism was the big idea of the first half of the 20th century, the creation of a European state was, I think, the big idea of the last half of the 20th century, and this one is as doomed to failure as the previous one. But it won't just fall on its own. We have got to fight it. And I'll tell you this, as long as there's breath in my body, I will go on in the United Kingdom fighting it. I will go on in the European Parliament fighting it. And I hope that you too, in the Czech Republic, will rise up and fight this thing and take back our birthright, democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Jistě se ke mně rádi přidáte v poděkování panu Farageovi za vynikající inspirativní přednášku. Jak možná již víte, pana Farage čeká od 8 hodin živé vystoupení v Hyde Parku v pořadu České televize a potřebuje si také trochu odpočinout před tou cestou do České televize a připravit se na to, takže už máme v tuto chvíli čas asi tak na 2-3 otázky. Takže já vás poprosím, kdo se chce ujmout slova, tak se musí také ujmout mikrofonu, takže tam vidím, tamhle druhou ruku a tady vidím ještě 2. Takže tyto 4 zvednuté ruce mají tedy přednostní právo. Františku, můžu tě poprosit ujmout se mikrofonu a proběhnout sál. Takže začni tam dotykem nosem.
Okay, please, could the British pound, you hear me? Could the British pound replace euro, because it's such a nice currency with very nice notes and very nice coins, so could it replace euro? In my opinion, it could. Thank you.
Could the British pound replace the euro? Should the British pound replace the euro? Look, I promise you, we're not in UKIP trying to rebuild the British Empire through stealth. I promise you that. Look, as far as I'm concerned, when you have different peoples with different economies and different governmental systems, it is better they have their own currencies. And actually, you know, it doesn't really matter whether you're a small country or a big country. The beauty of floating currencies is they act as a wonderful buffer against other countries when you're either doing very well or you're either doing very badly. So I don't see the British pound replacing the euro, but I do think that the Euro Titanic has now hit the iceberg. No, I really do think so, because, you know, just look at the desperate problems in countries like Spain, and the roadshow is moving on to Italy, I think, fairly soon. And I think what's going to happen is the southern European countries will one by one break away, get their own currencies back, and the first country that leaves will be the luckiest. Because the first country that leaves will be the first country that recovers, just as when Britain broke out of the gold standard in 1931, this was considered to be a terrible, shaming experience for the Brits, but because we bust out, we didn't suffer the depths of the depression, actually, that France and Germany did. So the first one out will do the best, and we will then finish up, sir, with a predominantly northern Eurozone, which frankly we may as well then call the greater Deutschmark zone. And then politically, countries like the Netherlands and Finland will have to ask themselves whether they're prepared to live in a totally German-dominated economy, and that will then become a political question. But I'm confident that actually the Deutschmark is coming back, the French franc is coming back, it's going to happen, and we'll finish up back where we started, and in 100 years' time, children will read history books and say to themselves, how on earth could they have been so stupid?
Good afternoon, Mr. Farage. Welcome to the Czech Republic.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you a rather practical question about European incentives. How would you explain to the majority of citizens that European incentives have also the, let's say, the other side of the coin, that they are forcing you to support the European agenda in your country? Could you take an example of citizens of Czech Republic, for example? Thank you for your answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, they're very good, the EU, with incentives. You know, I mean, Stalin used to kill his opponents. What the European Union do is just corrupt them with money. And so that's what they do. And they do it, I mean, Neil Kinnock is a very good example. Kinnock, Labour politician, patriotic Brit, totally opposed to us joining the common market or being part of a political union, and yet finished up his career as a two-term commissioner when enough pieces of silver were produced. So the union's very good at that. Equally, it's very good when it gives out money, particularly in the form of regional aid, to make sure that you put an EU flag has to go at the end of the bridge or on the building or whatever else it is. But don't forget, sir, we are not all beneficiary countries from this European project. Indeed, my country is currently paying out the princely sum of £51 million a day to be governed by Herman Van Rompuy and Mr. Barroso. Is it any wonder we're as Eurosceptic now as we are?
Good evening, Mr. Nigel. Nice to meet you in Czech Republic and Hyde Park later. Just a few questions, maybe I will say it in Czech. I understand you, but it's better, maybe for me. Is it possible? Is it okay? So I will say it in English. I'm sorry, can I? Co si myslíte o revoluci na Islandu, kde to začalo v roce 2008? Letos zatkli nebo byli obviněni x lidí z vlády a hlavně premiér. A nikdo nebyl uvězněn. Rádoby je to příklad pro všechny země na světě. Ale nic se tam nestalo. Tak váš názor na to, prosím. Děkuji.
Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that what happened back in 2008 in Iceland was really very dramatic. Very dramatic. A banking sector that was clearly way, way too big and out of control, and it all collapsed. And the currency fell by 80%, and 2 of their banks went bust, with investors losing money. Interest rates went to 20%, inflation was in the low 20%, and then they had a volcanic eruption. Do you remember? And it was almost of biblical proportions. And I remember in the European Parliament being shouted at by Martin Schulz. This is not unusual, by the way. But being shouted at by Martin Schulz when I said, who would you rather be today? Iceland or Ireland? And of course I was mocked because we were told that Ireland was being supported by the big EU, and you'll notice that in Iceland today, they're back at 3% annualised growth, inflation and interest rates are both back into single figures, foreign money is beginning to come back into Reykjavik, and Iceland, I think, has got a positive future. As for the former Prime Minister having to stand trial for what he's done, I don't think it's necessary to put politicians who've done things wrong in prison. Much more important for me that they're out there on Main Street so that we can hold them open to public ridicule. That's a much better punishment in my view.
Is it switched on? Yes. Mr. Farage, thank you very much. Of course, you are speaking to the converted here, as you can well appreciate. But my questions are my last 2 questions are somewhat, perhaps, more difficult. I have noticed that in Britain, your party is a single-issue party. Though I entirely agree with you, is it not possible to convert it into something much more important, a party that could perhaps compete with the Conservatives? That's question number 1. Then question number 2 is this, that I have many friends, not only on the left, but also on the moderate right, if you like, who think that the Union is a marvelous thing. There are a number of psychological reasons for that. One is that, you know, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe wanted to join the West and didn't realize they joined the Union. That was one problem, psychologically speaking. The other problem was that there's a huge propaganda machine, maybe hundreds of NGO organizations paid for by the unions, you probably would agree, and of course it's very difficult to counteract their arguments, because they say the peace in Europe for 60 years, you know, it's the cooperation between nations, it's the only way forward. There are huge blocks like China, India, Brazil, God knows what. We need to be huge, you know. There are a number of these arguments, I won't go into them, there's so many, and you definitely know them all, I'm sure. But what to say to people who fall in for all that, you know, how to somehow make them realize that the thing which looks idealistic, which looks positive, is actually so rotten and evil as you say. See, we had this problem with communism. It also had its good part. It also claimed that there will be more equality, more distribution of income, and more economy of scale, which would make goods so cheap for everyone. As my father used to say, fortunately, they failed economically, as the Union no doubt will fail in Italy and Spain. Thank you.
Okay, those two questions. Number one, when we set UKIP up, I think it was necessarily, in its early days, a single-issue protest party. And our job was to try and wake people up to the threat to our democracy, to our nation, to our economy that was posed by the European Union. But that has changed. What voters now want to know, they say, all right, Nigel, I'm with you, mate. I agree with you on the Europe bit, but what happens then? And because we're the only party in the UK advocating withdrawal from political union and its replacement with a trade deal, we're the only party free to think about how that independent Britain could and should be run. And that is why we've been, over the last couple of years, gradually developing a much bigger, broader domestic manifesto for how we want the country to run. And I think it's no coincidence that what the opinion polls now say is they don't just view UKIP as being a vehicle, a receptacle for protest votes in a European election. They now want to vote UKIP in local elections, and the opinion polls indicate we're even above the Lib Dems now in terms of how we'll do in the next general election. So I agree absolutely with the sentiment of your first question, but to some extent, sir, it's happening already. Your second question, what do you do when you meet the man or woman who believes in the big idea? Do you know what I do? Move on to the next person. I mean, frankly, life is too short to deal with dreamers. But seriously, what the Eurobarometer is the European Union's own polling research data, and it's very, very comprehensive, and it's very good, and it's very interesting, because what it shows is that actually right across the European Union, the number of people who fall into the category that you've described are now in a small minority. So what we've got to do is to mobilise those people who already feel with us in their hearts. We've got to make them with us in their heads as well. And the only way we are going to change this is by getting vast numbers of people to vote against the established political parties. So my advice, don't worry about the dreamers, move on to the next one. There is a massive audience out there of people who want a Europe of some kind. They want a forum in Europe where they feel we're working and trading together. We don't need the institutions of the European Union as they're currently structured to do that, and I think the potential for those out there that feel our way already is absolutely enormous, and that's why we're beginning to see this democratic revolution that is now beginning to take hold across Europe, and as far as I'm concerned, it can't happen soon enough.
Tak. Moc vám děkuji, že jste přišli podpořit pana Nigela Farage. And thank you, Nigel, for the hope you give us, for the inspiration, for the courage that you fight the battle, which is not merely the battle for the independence of the United Kingdom, but also the independence of our own country and our nation. I would like to give a small present at the end of this talk. This is Saint Wenceslav, who is the patron saint of Bohemia, who is a very good friend of St. George, patron of England. And so let their friendship strengthen our friendship, and let these two lead us into victory. Thank you, guys.